Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. The best-selling author of America Alone, The End of the World as We Know It, Mark Steyn publishes regularly in National Review, The Washington Times, Investor's Business Daily, and in venues in Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and is a frequent guest host for Rush Limbaugh. Hollywood writer and producer Rob Long started his career as a screenwriter for the hit television show Cheers. He writes a regular column for National Review magazine and records a weekly radio spot, Martini Shot, for KCRW in Los Angeles. Mr. Long is editor-in-chief of Ricochet.com, a center-right website that will launch this spring and in which Mr. Steyn is also participating. Welcome, gentlemen.
Can we say that you're also part of Ricochet.com, or is that
full disclosure?
Full disclosure.
You may say it. You may say it.
All right.
Segment 1, The Gipper, Then and Now. On October 27, 1964, 1 week before the presidential election, Ronald Reagan delivered a speech on national television on behalf of presidential candidate Senator Barry Goldwater, the Republican. President Johnson 1 week later buried Barry Goldwater in one of the biggest landslides in American history. But 2 years later, Ronald Reagan would be elected governor of California, and 16 years later as president of the United States. Ronald Reagan in 1964.
We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man.
Rob Long, grade that.
He's pretty good. It's amazing. Well, first of all, what's interesting is how quickly he speaks. He's actually doing. He slowed down, and I think slowing down was probably a better choice as he went on, because there's a lot of ideas packed in there. And I can't help but be depressed to think 36 years ago they were talking about Castro. 36 years later, we're still talking about Castro. So part of me is sort of astonished that a lot of these things are so incredibly relevant and happening today. But another part of me thinks, you know, this guy really knew how to deliver a message. And I think in this case, obviously, Goldwater didn't fare so well a week later, but in this case, the message was, I'm a leader. I'm a real leader.
Mark, I heard that and I was so struck. Of course, what he's talking about when he talks about the worst enemy that mankind has faced in the long ascent from the swamp, of course what he's talking about is Soviet communism. But I was so struck after rereading America Alone at how easily you can pick up the argument and drop it right down into the current circumstance. Yes?
Yeah, I think that's because it's really not about whatever you're talking about. It's never really about the enemy. It's always about us. That's to say, free, prosperous societies always have existential enemies. But what determines whether they triumph or not is not them, but us. And when he tells his story about the Cuban saying, "You don't know how lucky." The American says, we don't know how lucky we are, and the Cuban says, "You don't know how lucky I am. I had somewhere to go to. I'm not in the Cuban situation, but I came here and
Canada,
well, same healthcare system,
exactly,
except with a lower doctor-patient ratio.
Yeah.
But as
weather differences.
That's right. But as Reagan says, this is the last stand. I felt that. To be honest, I felt that after the 2008 election. I felt, wow, I finally got off the boat at Ellis Island, and I'm reading the base of the statue, and they're saying, "Give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. Oh, and by the way, if you've just got in from the old country, we're now reintroducing serfdom." And I think that is really the problem for those of us who've come here as immigrants, is we're seeing all the same mistakes that have been tried in Canada and Europe, and in Reagan's words, if this is the last stand, if the Cuban guy has somewhere to go to, where does anyone go now? You know, I saw one of your colleagues. I can't remember one of these Hollywood, one of these
One of
Hollywood,
them.
one of these
One of yours.
one of these Hollywood actors.
I apologize in advance.
One of these big A-list
Yeah.
celebrities years ago, and he was on this Bill Maher's show, and he's listening to some left-wing guy absent-mindedly nodding through everything the left-wing guy says, and then goes, well, wait a minute. The reality of it suddenly dawns on him, and he goes, well, wait a minute. If you do all that, where are the rest of us going to move to? And the Hollywood guy, it eventually dawned even on the Hollywood guy that this is the last stand.
This is the last stand. Yeah, you've arrived someplace and we've changed the brochure.
Yeah, that's right.
That's a little different now.
Product not as advertised.
Right, exactly.
So what do you make of that phrase, the last stand on earth, the story about the Cuban saying, I had someplace to escape to? The point, I say this as a former Reagan speechwriter, he wrote that himself.
Oh, he was a great writer. I mean, you can see it in the letters he wrote by hand, and you can see his little tiny old man little pencil scratchings on the speeches that they sometimes put on display at the library.
This is needless to say, a self-serving question to ask a table of writers, but is it not the case that he got where he was by exerting his mind on the issues of the day through the medium of a pen on paper? There really is no way to learn your own mind, except by writing. Wouldn't you too?
Well, that's
agree?
an old phrase people have said, how do I know what I think until I see what I write?
Right.
But I have a feeling that Ronald Reagan always knew what he thought. That was part of the power of his delivery, was
Yeah.
he really, really knew what he thought. You know, the most amazing thing is you watch that sort of grainy black and white footage, and this is a very old man, now dead, is speaking, and he seems to be talking on the face of it about a world in black and white. I mean, really a world that doesn't even exist anymore. And all you can think of is, my God, he's actually talking about today. And he was considered he's considered an artifact now. People are like, oh well, you know, the Cold War is over.
Right.
We're without the Cold War, without the giant polarities to sort of organize the globe. Where is the right wing going to go? Where is America going to be without a great enemy?
I have to
And
say,
it
when
sounds
I heard
perfectly
that,
relevant.
I'd forgotten. It's been years since I looked at this, and I felt there, black and white. If he were still alive, he'd be 100 next year. I agree. It feels like a different world, and yet it was as though he reached out and took me by the tie and said, "This still."
Not by the
But
tie
you know
either,
what,
by the way.
You know what it is? He's the opposite of what everyone said about him at the time. In 1980. When he ran for office, the standard joke was that he was the airheaded B-movie actor, the front man, who just said the words that people like you put in his mouth. In fact, nobody in modern American history has thought longer or harder about a coherent philosophical worldview than Ronald Reagan. And he did it in speeches like that. He'd been doing it for 15 years previously in all the stuff he was doing in the 50s. And I think that's the difference between him and a John McCain or many other of the candidates, or the Bob Dole, all kinds of other fellas we wind up with on the ticket.